rescinded their approvals for Kenya Airways to operate passenger flights between Nairobi and Dar es Salaam under third and fourth freedom traffic rights. The directive, which shall take effect Monday next week, has seen foreign affairs ministers from both Kenya and Tanzania come out and assured the public of a solution in the next 3 days. Now, to further understand the stalemate, Noah Kipkemboi had a conversation with Charles Sangazolani, who is the CEO of Propel Aviation. Let's listen in.
Right. So for this specific one that is being rescinded, the third and fourth freedom traffic rights, what does that mean specifically for this third and fourth freedom traffic rights, rather?
Now, what happens is that we have, like I said, the larger organization, ICAO, and then we have KCAA here, and we have Tanzanian Aviation Authority on the other end. Now, between the two, there's a framework of ICAO within which they can negotiate how to get into each other's airspace and then what they are allowed to do in that particular airspace. For instance, we are allowed to go to Tanzania, take passengers there, and carry passengers back. Now, what we are not allowed to do by Tanzania is go, say, to Zanzibar, and then pick guests from Zanzibar, take them to say, Dodoma or to Kilimanjaro International, because those ones become domestic flights. Now, they are not allowed to do that here either. They cannot land in Mombasa and bring people to Nairobi and so on. So this could be part of the provisions of the agreement they have made between them, just Kenya and Tanzania. But the framework is ICAO, the international organization, has made up the framework of how countries can agree about aviation. Now, when they do make this agreement, sometimes there are things you cannot anticipate. So, for example, you cannot anticipate what Kenya Airways will want to do later and the decades to come. In this case, it appears that the initial agreement, according to Kenya, did not allow cargo operations from Dar es Salaam to Nairobi. And when this case started, the assumption from Tanzanian end is that they actually are allowed to do that because it's covered in the entire agreement. Maybe it didn't specifically say cargo, but it just said they are transport from Tanzania to Nairobi. And they are surprised that Kenya is stopping them. Kenya Civil Aviation Authority is one stopping them. Remember, it's not Kenya Airways. Kenya is simply an airline. It's a business entity. It's the Civil Aviation Authority that allows these things to work. So if the authority says, we do not license you to operate cargo flights to Kenya, and this is the reasons we do, like for instance, storage capacity or a handling person or not knowing the source of your cargo, then they stop them. Now, the Tanzanian authority, in this case, reciprocated by saying, like, okay, we also suspend your operator license to Kenya, to Tanzania. You cannot now come to Tanzania until we resolve this matter, because it becomes a matter of authorities, not airlines. So the airlines don't really matter. Though they are both national airlines, but they don't matter. They're just players in these things, but they're not the real people who make the decisions. It's the authorities who make the decisions. In this case, they are simply saying, we are thinking you are unfair for stopping our airline from coming to your country for whatever reason, and we think it's not a concrete reason, so we are doing the same for you. That's the reciprocity they're talking about.
Now, in a situation where, first of all, we have a couple of days, we've been told this shall be solved within 3 days. But looking at the region, and because we've known for a long time, Kenya Airways has been the major operator in this region. So when we see also other players within the East Africa community coming up strongly, will we see this back and forth, not only between Kenya and Tanzania, but maybe Kenya and Uganda later on, where people need to relook some of these rights and how they were drafted initially, so that to sort of there is that element of reciprocity and fair level playing ground?
I absolutely agree. I anticipate that there's going to be quite a bit of issues. You know, when these things were set, for instance, in the international and in the East African community, people like, for instance, Uganda had very small planes which didn't have very large capacity. They didn't have even very long range. They were basically regional aircraft. People like Rwanda didn't have big planes either. They didn't have local pilots and so on. And as they are coming up, as obviously they will keep coming up, we're going to have much more of these issues, much more of these issues coming up where Rwanda, for instance, says, you guys come to Kigali, and this is what you do, and we want the same rights to come here. Now, the biggest issue, of course, we have is not basically the handling capacity or whether that can come into play. How does that competition play out for us? And how much rights should we allow them? And in some countries, they've gone even further where you find a big company, say like Rwanda, buys a stake, for instance, in SafariLink, for example. And then you find that the SafariLink now becomes their local arm. So they can get their passengers, say, at Jomo Kenyatta, and then they're handled locally by a local company. Now, that is something we haven't anticipated yet. And we have to get some think tank to look into that, because in the future, that's going to be a big problem. Capacities of airlines keep increasing all the time. Economies change, and it's business. So people want to get into all sorts of avenues that they can. So I think going forward, we will have to rethink on how these initial agreements were made and how best to redo them so that we don't get too many problems in the future, because this could happen. You can imagine how many people who had already booked to Tanzania or to Nairobi are now stranded because, you know, they made their bookings in advance and so on. And this can escalate and become quite a big issue because it's now a government issue, it's no longer an airline issue. So I think it's prudent that countries sit down with their aviation authorities and take a look at the agreements, because capacities will increase, capabilities will increase, and more businesses coming up, and guys will want to expand much further than they're doing right now.
What are you foreseeing the decision will be in the next 2 days, as communicated by the respective ministers for foreign affairs between the two countries?
In my view, I think it's going to be a sort of a compromise. So we'll have to find a compromise. There is a reason that the Civil Aviation Authority, Kenya, has frozen this operation for cargo. Now, the reasons must be, you know, substantial. They know maybe it must be handling capacity, maybe there may be something to do with the agreements they have with Kenyan cargo companies, who they are the ones who license, and so on. So there has to be quite a bit. I'm sure right now there's quite a bit of high-level meetings, including all stakeholders, including the airlines themselves, the cargo operators in Kenya, to find a way to break the stalemate. Because in the end, everybody loses, because I think even the cargo companies in Kenya now can't take them to Tanzania. Not only Kenya Airways, but even the smaller ones now can't operate, because when the authority covers something, it's a blanket ban and nobody can move until the thing is resolved. So I think there's going to be a sort of a compromise to see what are the real sticking points and how we can mitigate them with that without losing too much, either in terms of safety, in terms of operation capability, and also in terms of protecting your home market, which is basically one of the mandates that the Civil Aviation Authority of Kenya has. And I think the same for Tanzania. They have to protect their own markets and their own operators and their own citizens, so to speak. So whoever is operating this thing knows that our country is taking care of it. So I think it's going to be quite a bit of a back and forth as they try to find a middle ground where something can be allowed. Maybe even on a limited basis as they stamp out the smaller bits. But basically, I think in the end, they will agree. But now the face of what the new agreement will look like is what I think is still up in there.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Charles Sangazolani, CEO of Reciprocal Aviation, also has a loan over 2.5 decades